He stood at the base of the tree with an axe in his hand. All around him the pagans had gathered, hundreds of them, Hessians who had lived and died by this oak for generations. It was their god's tree, Donara's tree. The thunder god lived in the roots. The thunder god breathed through the upper branches. To touch it was to invite death. To cut it was to dare a power that had outlasted every king, every tribe, every invader who had ever come through this forest. And Winfrith of Devon, a monk, an Englishman, a stranger who should not have been alive for 10 reasons before breakfast, raised the axe. He was not a soldier. He had no army behind him. He had crossed a sea to get here, walked through forests where lesser men had already been killed. He had survived by the tenacity of his faith and the improbable protection of a Frankish ruler who could have abandoned him at any moment. He had no guarantee the tree would fall. He had no guarantee he would not fall with it. He swung anyway. The man who would become Boniface began life as Winfrith, a small boy in Crediton in the kingdom of Wessex, at the edge of a world still rough with conversion. England had been Christian for barely a century. The faith was new enough that you could still feel its edges, still find places where the old things lingered just beneath the surface. Winfrith was not a man of violence or failure or dramatic vice. His brokenness was quieter than that. He was a man of enormous gifts, scholarship, eloquence, a capacity for leadership that his monastery recognized early. He wrote the first Latin grammar known to be produced in England. He was elected abbot of Nursling at a relatively young age. Every reasonable measure of success lay before him. And it was not enough. The axe, not the sword. That phrase would define his entire life. The idea that the right instrument, wielded with absolute conviction at the right moment, could accomplish what armies could not. He did not want to administrate a monastery. He wanted to go to the place where no one had yet swung the axe. He had heard the stories coming from the continent, whole tribes still living in the shadow of sacred groves, still offering to gods of wood and storm, still outside the reach of the gospel. The first time he asked permission to leave, his abbot refused. He accepted that. He waited. When Abbot Winbert died and the monks elected Winfrith to replace him, he declined and asked again for permission to go. This time, no one stopped him. A man who could walk away from the abbacy of Nursling, who could set aside the one prize his world had to offer, was a man who had already settled something in his soul. He sailed for Frisia in 716. He was around 40 years old. He did not know he would never live in England again. The first mission failed. He arrived in Frisia in 716 to find the pagan ruler Radbod in open war with the Frankish church. The doors were shut, the fields were closed. He turned around and went home. Most men would have read that as an answer. Winfrith read it as an interruption. He was back in Rome within 2 years, carrying a letter from his bishop and a purpose that could not be argued out of him. Pope Gregory II received him and did something that changed everything. He gave the English monk a new name and a new mission. The name was Boniface, after an early martyr. The mission was Germany, the lands beyond the Rhine that no organized church had yet reached. Boniface knelt before the Pope and received a commission that was, by any calculation, nearly impossible. He was being sent to a place with no existing church infrastructure, no sympathetic rulers guaranteed, no established Christian community to welcome him. He would be a bishop without a diocese, a shepherd before the sheep existed. He said yes. He walked out of Rome with a papal letter, a missionary mandate, and the name of a martyr. And he went north, into the dark, where the oaks still stood. The axe, not the sword. That was his strategy. Not conquest, not coercion. The direct, public confrontation of pagan power on its own ground, and the willingness to stand there unarmed while the sky decided what happened next. Episode 1. The Oak at Geismar. By 723, Boniface had been in Germany for years. He had baptized, he had preached, he had established communities in Thuringia and Hesse. But the great sacred sites still stood. The groves still drew worshippers. And nothing communicated the limits of Christian power quite like the fact that Donar's oak, the largest, oldest, most revered of all the sacred trees, still rose over Geismar, untouched, immovable, the living symbol of everything that had not changed. According to Willibald's Vita, written within a generation of these events, drawing on the testimony of those who were there, Boniface went to Geismar with an axe and announced what he was going to do. The crowd gathered. They came to watch him die. He began to cut. Willibald records that before Boniface could finish, a great wind arose and blew the ancient tree over, an event his companions received as miraculous intervention. The oak fell. No thunderbolt followed. Donar did not respond. The crowd stood in silence and looked at what remained of their god's tree. Boniface used the wood from the fallen oak to build a chapel to St. Peter. The tradition that the tree split into 4 pieces, forming the shape of a cross, comes from later devotional accounts. It is a beautiful image, but it should be noted that Willibald does not record it. What Willibald does record is the silence of a God who did not come. That was enough. Conversions followed, communities formed, the chapel became a church. The church became part of a network that would eventually transform a continent. He did not need a sword. He brought an axe. Episode 2. Building the church across Germany. What Boniface did after Geismar was not dramatic in the way a single confrontation is dramatic. It was harder than that. It was 30 years of relentless, grinding, organizational work, founding monasteries, training clergy, establishing bishoprics, holding synods, correcting error, building from nothing. He sent letters back to England, remarkable letters, many of which still survive, asking abbesses and monks to send books, send cloth, send capable people. One letter to the abbess Eadburger asks her to copy a manuscript in gold letters so that aged eyes can read scripture more clearly. He was building an institutional church in a wilderness with quill and ink and the persistent human effort of people who believed the thing was worth doing. Pope Gregory III elevated him to archbishop in 731. He founded the monastery of Fulda in 744, still standing today, still in use. He organized the Council of Esten in 743, the first general synod of the Frankish Church in decades. He worked with the Carolingian rulers Carloman and Pepin to anchor the church in law and governance. He was a bureaucrat of the gospel and administrator of eternity. He understood that confronting a God's tree was a single day's work, but what came after required everything else. He was nearly 70 years old when he decided he was not done. Episode 3. The Return to Frisia. The province that had turned him back as a young man was still not finished. Willibald of Mainz tells us that in his old age, Boniface learned that many in Frisia had drifted back into paganism after the death of Willibald, the earlier missionary who had worked the region. The church he had helped build was thinning at the edges. He could have stayed in Mainz. He was the archbishop. He had earned the right to be carried to his grave from a cathedral, surrounded by clergy who owed their ordinations to him. He chose differently. He resigned his archbishopric. He organized a final expedition. He crossed into Frisia in 753 with a company of companions, priests, deacons, a bishop named Eoban, who was his friend, and went back to the beginning. Accounts tell us the mission succeeded enormously. Thousands were instructed, thousands were baptized. The old man, who had once been turned away at this same frontier, was now welcomed across it. and the work that had been unwinding began to be gathered back in. He scheduled a great confirmation service for the new believers, to be held on the eve of Pentecost, June 5, 754, on the plain of Dockham, on the banks of the river Bourne. He was approximately 79 years old. He rose early that morning to prepare. They came before the service began. The accounts describe an armed group, pagan Frisians, arriving at the camp in the morning hours. Willibald's Vita, the earliest and most reliable account, tells us that when his companions reached for their weapons, Boniface stopped them. He would not allow it. He forbade resistance. According to Willibald, he went to his death willingly, holding relics, the presence of the holy carried into the moment of the holy. Later accounts, written within decades of his death, drawing on testimony, including that of an eyewitness, add a detail that has become the enduring image of his martyrdom, that Boniface raised a gospel book over his head as the blows came. Whether as a physical shield or a spiritual one, the earliest of these later sources are uncertain. What is not uncertain is that a gospel book bearing sword cuts through its pages was preserved at Fulda as a relic, a book sliced nearly in two, still carrying the words it was opened to when the blade found it. 52 companions died with him on that plain. He had gone back to the beginning, to the people who had first refused him, to close the circle. He had lived by the conviction that the axe, not the sword, was the instrument of transformation, that you confronted the darkness unarmed, with only what you believed, and let God answer for what happened next. He had done that at Geismar with an oak tree.
He did it again at Dockham with a book, the axe, not the sword. He had held to it until he had nothing left to hold. His body was carried to Fulda, per the instruction he had given years before. His people carried him through the forests he had spent a lifetime walking. He rests there still, in the cathedral he had asked for, in the land he had consecrated with his life. Germany did not forget him. The German bishops have gathered every year at Fulda since the medieval period, in the city, around the tomb, above the bones of the man who built their church. Fulda itself became one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The monks trained there fanned outward. The episcopal structure Boniface established across Germany persisted. The dioceses of Würzburg, Erfurt, Eichstätt, Buderberg became anchors of Christian civilization through the chaos of the centuries that followed. When Charlemagne consolidated the Frankish Empire, he built on a church that Boniface had organized and rooted. The chain reaches further than Germany. Boniface's letters record a community of English missionaries, men and women, whom he recruited and deployed across the continent. Saint Leoba, his cousin, became abbess of Bischofsheim, and a figure of learning and authority in her own right. Saint Lullus succeeded him at Mainz. Saint Eoban, who died beside him at Dockham, had helped carry the mission to Utrecht. One man's conviction produced a generation. One generation produced a church. One church produced a civilization. The Ragendrudis Codex still sits in Fulda today, the slashed gospel book or one of its companion manuscripts from that morning. Scholars still debate which pages were open when the sword fell. Whatever those pages said, they were worth a man's life to hold on to. Maybe you have been standing at the base of your own oak tree, the thing in your life that seems immovable, ancient, too large and too established to ever come down. Boniface did not arrive at Geismar with a plan or an army. He arrived with a conviction and a willingness to swing. The same God who answered that morning is not finished answering. The axe, not the sword, the right instrument in the right hands at the right moment. That is still enough. History forgot them, but they were faithful, and now it's our turn to remember. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes of Faith.